Drenched and panting from a run, I, Emma, 19, hit the shower in our Austin home. Stepdad Finn, 55, extract coach, burst in, thinking I'd flooded it. I teased, "Catch me," and splashed him. His grip on my wrist sparked heat, way beyond steam. Mom's away, 2 weeks burned wild, what crashed us hard. You'll reel, the Austin air was thick with summer heat as I, Emma, 19, sprinted back to our house, sweat soaking my tank top and shorts, my ponytail swinging after a 5-mile run. I'd been pushing harder lately, partly to impress my stepdad, Finn, a 55-year-old extract coach whose stories of chasing medals always lit a spark in me. Mom was off on a work trip, some marketing conference, leaving us alone for 2 weeks. Her last call a sharp bet I'd stay out of trouble, way off. Finn's eyes had a habit of lingering too long, his coaching tips laced with something heavier, and I'd felt it, a pull I didn't quite name. I burst through the back door, panting, and bolted for the bathroom, craving a cold shower. I kicked off my sneakers, peeled down to my sports bra and shorts, and cranked the water, steam rising as I stepped in, the chill hitting my skin. I was mid-rinse, water splashing, when the door flew open by Finn, in a faded tee and track pants, stormed in, yelling I'd left the faucet running, bet I'd fled the place. I laughed, flirty, splashing water his way, saying he'd chased medals, bet he'd catch me instead. He froze, eyes flicking over me, then smirked, saying catching was my stunt, bet I'd slip first. I grinned, leaned out, my shoulder brushing the shower frame, flirty, teasing he looked hot barging in, bet he'd race me for it. He stepped closer, water speckling his shirt, and grabbed my wrist, light but firm, to calm me, muttering I was a hazard. Bet I'd wreck his pipes. My pulse jumped, his grip warm, and I pressed closer, my wet arm grazing his chest, flirty, saying wrecking was my pace, bet he'd keep up anyway. He didn't let go, his fingers lingering, teasing I'd cost him, bet I'd owe a new shower. I bumped his hip with my knee, flirty, saying owing was my spark, bet he'd collect it quick. The steam thickened, and I splashed him again, giggling, my hand brushing his as I flicked water, teasing he was too steady, bet he'd slip for me. He smirked, tugged me gently from the spray, his hand sliding to my elbow, muttering slipping was my trap, bet I'd drag him down. I grinned, my foot slipping on the tile, and I stumbled, catching his arm, my chest brushing his, flirty, saying dragging was my rush, bet he'd pull me up. He steadied me, his hand brushing my back, light, warm, teasing that pulling was my game, bet I'd hook him deep. I leaned in, my knee grazing his thigh, flirty, saying hooking was my thrill, bet he'd tug it sharp. The water hissed, the room foggy, and I stepped back, grabbing a towel, my arm brushing his as I wrapped it, teasing he looked damn good soaked, bet he'd chase my heat. He smirked, wiped his face, his hand grazing my shoulder, muttering chasing was my dodge, bet I'd blaze him out. I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying blazing was my vibe, bet he'd fan it anyway. He leaned closer, his arm brushing mine, teasing that fanning was my chaos, bet I'd fled this house. I grinned, tossed the towel at him, my fingers brushing his chest, flirty, saying flooding was my win, bet he'd swim it anyway. He caught it, his smirk sharp, muttering swimming was my trap, bet I'd sink him too. The bathroom steamed, the shower still running, and I stayed close, saying he was too good, bet he'd race my spark. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the towel, teasing that racing was my hustle, bet I'd reel him too far. I grinned, bumped his hip one last time, flirty, saying reeling was my bet he'd bite it hard. He didn't pull back, just watched, water dripping, tension thick, and I knew I'd hooked him, shower on, stakes high. I stepped out, leaving him with the towel, his eyes trailing, and headed to my room, the heat lingering, bet it'd burn hotter. 2 days after the steamy shower spark, I was still buzzing from Finn's grip, his teasing words looping in my head like a catchy track. Mom was still off on her marketing conference trip, her last text a brisk bet I'd keep the house intact, way off. I wandered into the kitchen of our Austin home that morning, barefoot in a loose tank and leggings, the air sharp with citrus and the hum of a blender. Finn stood at the counter, tossing berries into the mix, his faded running tee clinging to his frame, shorts showing off legs that had outrun half the town. He didn't look up, just pulsed the blender, grumbling I'd better not swipe his fuel, bet I'd choke on it. I grinned, slid onto a stool near him, my elbow brushing the counter by his arm, flirty, saying he looked hot mixing, bet he'd blend me something wild. He smirked, poured the smoothie into a glass, and said blends didn't flirt, bet I'd spill it first. I leaned closer, my knee nudging the counter's edge, teasing that spilling was my stride, bet he'd sip it anyway. He glanced over, his hand brushing the glass by my wrist, fingers lingering, and said sipping was my dodge, bet I'd trip him up. I bumped his shoulder with mine, flirty, saying tripping was my spark, bet he'd chase it tight. He smirked, slid the glass my way, his knuckles grazing mine, muttering sparking was my mess, bet I'd owe him for this shake. I took a sip, tart and cold, teasing, saying owing was my hook, bet he'd pour it with that grin. He leaned on the counter, his shoulder shifting closer, teasing back, saying pouring was my hustle, bet I'd burn him dry. I grinned, bumped my knee against the stool, flirty, saying burning was my kick, bet he'd gulp it anyway. He smirked, grabbed his own glass, his arm brushing the blender near mine, muttering gulping was my trap, bet I'd reel him out. I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying reeling was my rush, bet he'd tug it sharp the blender word, and we started bickering about running routes. He swore by the river trail, I argued for the hill loop, teasing he'd lose, bet I'd outpace him. He laughed, saying I'd eat dust, bet I'd cramp in a mile. I grabbed the smoothie, flirty, waving it, saying I'd show him, bet I'd lap him. He smirked, reached for it, and I pulled back, my elbow knocking the glass. It tipped, purple splashing his tea, and I gasped, giggling, grabbing a rag, dabbing his chest, my fingers lingering, flirty, saying oops, bet I'd owe him big. He caught my wrist, light, teasing, muttering owing was my chaos, bet I'd cost him a shirt. I leaned in, my shoulder brushing his chest, flirty, saying costing was my vibe, bet he'd wear it anyway. He smirked, took the rag, his hand grazing my arm, muttering wearing was my dream, bet I'd stain him more. I bumped his hip, teasing, saying staining was my thrill, bet he'd clean it up. The kitchen pulsed, sunlight streaming, and I stayed close, sipping what was left, saying he was too steady, bet he'd flare if I pushed. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the rag, muttering flaring was my mess, bet I'd torch this counter. I stood, stretching, my knee brushing his thigh, flirty, saying he looked too good soaped, bet he'd spark a race. He smirked, tossed the rag, his arm brushing my shoulder, muttering racing was my snare, bet I'd drag him down. I bumped his chest, teasing, saying dragging was my win, bet he'd sprint it anyway. The smoothie dripped, tension thick, and I stepped back, grabbing a towel, saying he was too slick, bet he'd chase my spark. He smirked, leaned in, his hand brushing mine, muttering chasing was my hustle, bet I'd reel him too far. I grinned, bumped his hip, flirty, saying reeling was my bet, I bet he'd bite it hard. I knew I'd hooked him, blend spilled, stakes soaring point 4 days after the smoothie spill, the Austin sun blazed, turning the backyard into a heat-soaked patch of grass and concrete where I lounged on a folding chair, scrolling my phone, the air sharp with dust and motor oil. Mom was still off on her marketing conference trip. Her last text a curt bet I'd keep the chaos down, not a chance. I'd been replaying Finn's quick smirks, his steady grip, and they'd taken root deeper than I'd planned. He came out, hauling an old treadmill to the patio, his faded running tee clinging to his sweat-slicked frame, shorts loose, a wrench in hand. He muttered I'd better not mess with it, bet I'd break the thing. I grinned, tossed my phone, flirty, saying he looked sexy fixing, bet he'd tuned faster tracks than this. He smirked, twisted a bolt, and said tracks didn't flirt, bet I'd jam it first. I stood, sauntering over, my sneakers scuffing the concrete near his knees, teasing that flirting was my sprint, bet he'd pace it anyway. He glanced up, his hand brushing the wrench by my leg, fingers twitching close, and said pacing was my dodge, bet I'd trip him out. I leaned in, my elbow grazing his shoulder, flirty, saying tripping was my spark, bet he'd race it tight. He smirked, tightened a screw, his arm nudging mine, muttering sparking was my mess, bet I'd owe him for this fix, grabbed a screwdriver from the toolbox, twirling it, teasing that owing was my hook, bet he'd bolt it with that grin. He took it, his fingers brushing mine, teasing, saying bolting was my bluff, bet I'd con him into more. I bumped his hip, flirty, saying conning was my kick, bet he'd run it anyway. He smirked, leaned closer, his knee brushing my leg, muttering running was my trap, bet I'd reel him too deep. I grinned, tapped the treadmill's frame, flirty, saying reeling was my rush, bet he'd dash it sharp, the sun scorched, and we started bickering about speed. He bragged he'd clocked sub-6-minute miles. I swore I'd outdash him, flirty, saying I'd smoke him, bet he'd eat my dust. He laughed, challenged me to a backyard sprint, bet I'd crash in 10 steps. I bolted to the grass, daring him, my tank top shifting as I took off, Finn chasing, his sneakers pounding behind. I pushed hard, but my foot caught a root, and I tumbled, sprawling in the dirt, laughing, my shorts riding up. He lunged, catching my waist, his hands firm, pulling me up, his chest brushing my back, muttering I was a wreck. Bet I'd cost him a LAPIMY pulse raced, his grip lingering, and I bumped his chest with my elbow, flirty, saying costing was my vibe. Bet he'd save me anyway. He smirked, steadied me, his hand brushing my arm, teasing that saving was my snare. Bet I'd drag him down. I grinned, bumped his hip, flirty, saying dragging was my thrill. Bet he'd sprinted up. The treadmill hummed as he tested it, and I stayed close, saying he was too steady. Bet he'd flare if I pushed. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the frame, muttering flaring was my chaos. Bet I'd torch this yard. I grabbed a water bottle, sipping slow, my knee brushing his thigh, flirty, saying he looked damn good out here. Bet he'd race my spark. He smirked, took it, his fingers grazing mine, muttering racing was my trap. Bet I'd reel him too far. I bumped his shoulder, teasing, saying reeling was my win. Bet he'd chase it hard. The dusk settled, tension thick, and I stepped back, saying he was too slick. Bet he'd catch my rush. He smirked, turned the wrench, his arm brushing mine, muttering catching was my hustle. Bet I'd hook him deep. I grinned to the flirty, knowing I'd snagged him, treadmill fixed, stakes fired. 3 days after the backyard sprint, the Austin evening settled soft, the living room flickering with the glow of a single lamp, the radio crackling an old rock tune from a corner speaker. Mom was still off on her marketing conference trip. Her last text a clipped bet I'd kept the house sane, wildly off. I'd been chewing on Finn's steady smirks, his quick catches, and they'd burrowed deeper than I'd meant. I sprawled on the couch, legs kicked over the armrest, sipping a beer I'd grabbed from the fridge, my loose tank and shorts shifting as I leaned back. Finn came in, a six-pack in hand, his faded running tee loose over track pants, hair mussed from a nap. He tossed a can to me, his fingers brushing the air as I caught it, muttering I'd better not chug it. I bet I'd wipe out first. I grinned, oh flirty, saying he looked slick tossing. Bet he'd crack me another. He smirked, dropped onto the couch beside me, his knee grazing the cushion by my thigh, and said cracking wasn't my pace. Bet I'd slur it flat. I swung my legs down, my elbow nudging his arm, flirty, teasing that slurring was my rhythm. Bet he'd drink it too. He cracked his own can, his hand brushing the table near my wrist, teasing, saying drinking was my dodge. Bet I'd reel him dry. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying reeling was my spark. Bet he'd chase it anyway. He smirked, sipped slow, his arm brushing mine, muttering chasing was my hustle. Bet I'd hook him out. The radio hit a faster beat, and I stood, swaying, flirty, saying he looked too stiff. Bet he'd dance me wild. He smirked, set his beer down, saying dancing was my trap. Bet I'd trip him up. I grabbed his hand, pulling him up, my hip brushing his as we shuffled to the music. His arm slid around my waist, light, guiding, muttering tripping was my mess. Bet I'd drag him down. I spun under his arm, flirty, my shoulder grazing his chest, teasing that dragging was my groove. Bet he'd match it. He pulled me back, his knee brushing mine, smirking, saying matching was my snare. Bet I'd twist him rod. We danced, the rug scuffing, and I stumbled, my foot catching his, giggling as I tipped forward. He caught me, his hands firm on my hips, pulling me upright, muttering I was a hazard. Bet I'd owe him for that. I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying owing was my spark. Bet he'd collect it anyway. He smirked, his hand brushing my back, teasing that collecting was my chaos. Bet I'd cost him more. I leaned in, flirty, saying costing was my rush. Bet he'd pay it sharp. He spun me again, and I swayed, asking about his racing days. Bet he'd outrun legends. He smirked, slowed the dance, his arm loose around my shoulders, launching into a story about a 90s marathon, outpacing a rival in the final stretch, his voice low, eyes locked on mine, teasing I'd have quit. Bet I'd eat dust. I bumped his hip, flirty, saying dust was my vibe. Bet I'd lap him now. The song faded, and I stayed close, my knee brushing his thigh, teasing he looked too good spinning tails. Bet he'd run me wild. He smirked, his hand brushing my arm, muttering running was my trap. Bet I'd blaze him out. The night hummed, beers piling, and I flopped back on the couch, saying he was too steady. Bet he'd flare if I dared. He smirked, sat close, his arm brushing my shoulder, muttering flaring was my mess. Bet I'd burn this room. I bumped his knee, flirty, saying burning was my thrill. Bet he'd fan it anyway. He leaned in, his hand brushing my wrist, muttering fanning was my hustle, bet I'd hook him deep. I grinned, flirty, knowing I'd reeled him, radio low. Stakes high. Mom's return loomed, her work trip ending tomorrow. Her last text betting I'd stayed tame, blind to my 2-week spark with Finn in our Austin home. I craved a wild night, coaxing him to a dive bar downtown. In a tight top and jeans, I hopped into his truck, his dark jacket sharp. He parked, muttering I'd spark trouble, bet I'd drag him in. I grinned, flirty, nudging his arm, saying he looked hot for a coach, bet he'd race me here. The bar roared, lights strobing, music pounding. I tossed out truth or dare, teasing he'd balk. He smirked, ordered beers, saying balking was my vibe, bet I'd dare him big. I chose dare, and he said dance, bet I'd trip. I hit the floor, swaying close, flirty, my hip grazing his, teasing he'd better join, bet he'd match me. He stepped in, hands light on my waist, muttering matching was my trap, bet I'd spin him out. I spun, my shoulder brushing his chest, saying spinning was my spark, bet he'd catch it. The crowd pulsed, and I stumbled, falling against him, my hands on his arms, flirty, giggling he looked too good, bet he'd flare. He steadied me, grip warm, teasing flaring was my mess, bet I'd burn this bar. I pressed closer, my knee brushing his, saying burning was my rush, bet he'd fan it. He smirked, hand brushing my shoulder, muttering fanning was my hustle, bet I'd blaze him out. I grinned, heart racing, wanting more, hooked tight, bar wild, stakes wilder. The night after our bar run, Mom's return loomed large, her work trip cut short. Her last text a horse bet I'd kept things tame, utterly blind to the wildfire I'd ignited with Brock. 58, ex-casino dealer, over 2 weeks in our Seattle home. We'd stumbled in past 3 a.m., buzzed from beers and bar dares. The truck swerving as I'd teased he'd owned the dance floor, bet he'd own me next. He'd smirked, parked crooked, and we'd tripped inside, my head spinning from booze and his electric pull. I'd felt it all night, his hands, his heat, and I wasn't backing off. In my jeans and fitted top, I swayed in the hall, tossing my jacket, flirty, saying he'd ruled the bar, bet he'd deal me in now. He slammed the door, his tight tee clinging, jeans low, growling dealing was my hustle, bet I'd bust it fast. I grinned, lurched closer, my hip grazing his, teasing that busting was my flair, bet he'd grab it. He caught my wrists, light but firm, pulling me toward his room, muttering I'd pushed too far, bet I'd sink us tonight. I laughed, flirty, bumped his chest with my shoulder, saying sinking was my rush, bet he'd dive in. He shoved the door open, his hand brushing my arm, guiding me inside. I flopped onto his bed, jeans shifting, slurring we'd play truth or dare, bet he'd pick truth like a rookie. He sank beside me, knee nudging mine, smirking, saying truth was my dodge, bet I'd dare him wild. I chose dare, and he grinned, saying sing that bar song, bet I'd choke. I belted a sloppy verse, giggling, my hand brushing his arm, flirty, daring him, bet he'd sing too. He smirked, growled a line, his voice rough, muttering singing was my trap, bet I'd reel him out. I upped it, daring him to ditch his belt, bet he'd fumble. He laughed, tugged it off, his fingers grazing my knee as he tossed it, teasing fumbling was my mess, bet I'd drag him down. I grinned, chose dare again, and he smirked, saying sit on my lap, bet I'd bolt. My heart raced, and I slid over, perching lightly, my hands on his shoulders, flirty, teasing he'd fold, bet he'd flare. He smirked, his hands brushing my waist, light warm, muttering flaring was my chaos, bet I'd burn him out. I bumped his chest, flirty, saying burning was my thrill, bet he'd fan it slow. His grip tightened, teasing, pulling me closer, his breath sharp, growling fanning was my snare, bet I'd blaze him raw. I dared him, take my scarf off, bet he'd shake. His fingers brushed my neck, tugging it slow, lingering, muttering shaking was my game, bet I'd pull him too far. I leaned in, my knee brushing his thigh, flirty, saying pulling was my win, bet he'd chase it hard. The room spun, tension snapping, and I pushed the dare, tugged my sleeve, bet he'd flinch. He smirked, pulled it down an inch, his hand brushing my shoulder, teasing flinching was my hustle, bet I'd tip us over. I grinned, my fingers grazing his chest, flirty, saying tipping was my rush, bet he'd steady me. Then headlights slashed the dark, Mom's voice roared, home early, yelling where we were. I froze, scrambled off, yanking my scarf, heart pounding, muttering she's back, bet we're done. Brock bolted up, cursing, smoothing his tea, saying timing was hell, bet she'd lose it. Mom stormed in, bags crashing, eyes blazing, screaming why I was on his bed, Drunk? I stammered it was nothing, bet she'd blow it. She grabbed my arm, yelling at Brock he'd crossed it, out, we're gone. He said I'd sparked it, bet she'd see my fault, but she shoved past, hauled me to my room, stuffed my bag, shouting we're leaving, now. She dragged me to the car, tires screeching, leaving him in the dark. I slumped, buzzed dead, knowing I'd lit it. I bet it torched us all. The car screeched away from our Seattle home, Mom's grip tight on the wheel, her face a storm as she hissed I'd betrayed her, bet I'd planned to ruin everything. I slumped in the passenger seat, the buzz from the bar and Brock's bedroom dares gone, my heart still pounding from the near miss with him, 58, ex-casino dealer, whose touch lingered like a bad bet. I muttered it was nothing, bet she'd calm down. She snapped, eyes blazing, saying nothing didn't end with me drunk on his bed, bet I'd pay for this. We pulled into a motel, the neon sign buzzing, and she stormed inside, booking a room, leaving me by the car. My phone pinged Brock's text, you lit it, kid. Bet you're still sparking. I grinned, flirty despite the mess, texting back I'd burned him, bet he'd chase it. He replied, chasing's your trap, bet I'd catch you. My pulse raced, and I deleted the thread, knowing I'd pushed too far. Mom returned, tossing me a key, muttering we'd talk tomorrow, bet I'd regret it. I followed her in, the room stale, and stood by the window, my shoulder brushing the curtain, flirty thoughts of Brock lingering, bet he'd dare me again. The night hummed, tension thick, and I knew I'd hooked him, motel cold, stakes hotter. What'd blow up next? Bet it'd blaze.